with that, I believe that covers our announcements for this morning, and I'd like to ask our President-elect Pam Harris to come up and share with us a little bit about our theme for the day and introduce our keynote speaker.
Good morning. Again, thank you to Jonathan Mattiello for the funds that he provides NACM, and I hope that all of you look at your courts because SJI will fund initiatives in your courts as well. Today, the educational curriculum will surround leadership. We were talking about governance yesterday. Today's leadership. We have a plenary speaker. We have 6 workshops, and then this afternoon we have our shared interest groups, and there's 4 of them. If you're a federal court clerk, or maybe not, you might want to be interested in the federal courts. There's a group that will be talking about that. There's a group that will be talking about family and juvenile courts. There's a group that will be talking about general jurisdiction courts, and another group about limited jurisdiction courts. So it's a roundtable discussion. They're always interesting. You hear from your colleagues what their issues are. Stephanie has put together a great program, and we think you'll enjoy that this afternoon. Today, our keynote speaker is Dr. Walter Nademeyer. He's going to discuss leadership in very different ways. He's going to explain situational leadership. He's going to do an assessment, and he's going to talk about how you get people to follow you. He's also going to talk about overleading, micromanaging, things that we sometimes do and shouldn't do because we don't allow our employees or our followers to really embrace what they should be doing and making themselves better people, better employees. I think we're really going to enjoy this morning with Dr. Nademeyer because he's a leading authority on situational leadership, employee motivation, strategic planning, and team building, very important in courts. He's authored numerous books, articles, training instruments, and other management topics over the years. He's designed and conducted management development programs for over 100 major companies and organizations here in the United States and abroad. He's an internationally recognized management author, consultant, and educator. He was a management professor at Ohio University, the University of Houston, and the University of Houston at Clear Lake. He's received his BBA, MBA degrees from Ohio University and his PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Houston. If you would welcome me in asking Dr. Nademeyer to come up and kick off this morning, I think you're going to enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Well, good morning, NACM. Are you having a good week? Great. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here. Some of you know that court managers have a very special place in my heart for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, my wife is a court administrator. She's worked for 25 years in a criminal court in Houston, Texas, so I get to hear about the challenges and the joys and the frustrations that you face in your career on a pretty regular basis. Secondly, one of my longest professional associations has been with the Texas Association of Court Administration. For 35 years, I've had an opportunity to conduct leadership classes in their professional development program. The gentleman who received the Warren Berger Award yesterday, Bob Wessels, was one of my graduate students at the University of Houston, and he got me involved in the TACA classes and also gave me an opportunity to speak to this group a couple of times before. Leadership is a subject of tremendous interest to me and a lot of other people. I can recall as far back as being a teenager, being fascinated with ups and downs of organizations and sports teams. Let me give you a sports trivia quiz. The major college that has won the national championship in football the most is... Nope. Now, when you think of college football, traditional college football, how about Notre Dame? Notre Dame. And I was in high school, 1962. They had one of the worst seasons ever. They won 1 game, lost 9. The very next season, with almost the identical team offensively and defensively and a tougher schedule, they finished with an 8-1 record. Now that's a remarkable turnaround in 1 year's time with the same players. But there was one very significant difference, 62 to 63, namely new coach. Ara Parseghian came on board and rapidly transformed a bunch of losers into a highly cohesive team of winners. And if you're looking around what's going on within organizations, you see the same kind of thing happening, right? New leader comes on board, and pretty soon people are more motivated, more productive. Unfortunately, you sometimes see the opposite as well, where a new person comes on board and everything craters. So it is the most researched topic within the field of management, and I'll try to share some ideas with you today that you can go back and put to use immediately. One other reason why I'm here is that when I was an undergraduate student at Ohio University, I had a couple of classes from Professors Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard. I loved the courses. I got to know them, decided to go on and get my MBA, and the two of them asked for me to be their graduate assistant. And it happened to be the time that they were first developing the situational leadership model, which has become the most widely taught leadership concept. I have continued to work with them. I published a book with Paul Hersey last year. We're working on another one for next year that's going to be focusing on situational power and influence. So let's take a look at some important ideas about leadership. First of all, a good starting point would be to define leadership as the process of influencing others in efforts toward goal accomplishment. Leadership is about influencing people to do certain things, keeping them from doing other things. Now, if you think about who engages in the most influence attempts on a day-to-day basis within the court, in many situations it would be people in your position. And leadership is an extremely important topic, I think, for anybody who is a court administrator. Now, over the years, I've concluded that people who become great leaders have 3 common elements, that there are really 3 steps to becoming a great leader. First of all, you have to have it in your heart to have genuine concern for helping other people do their jobs well. People who I've seen who are into it pretty much for themselves often do things that don't make them great leaders of others. Secondly, we have to use our head. We have to think things through and decide what's the most effective way for me to behave as a leader in this situation. And then the third step is to change our behavior accordingly. And that means sometimes operating outside of our natural comfort zone. Now, to make a long story short, research on leadership has consistently found that leaders do two important things. They provide direction to people, and they provide support to people. So when we talk here about directive behavior, that's explaining what, where, when, how to do things to others. And some of us as leaders are highly directive. We spend a lot of time engaging in those behaviors. Others among us do not. Then the other category, supportive behavior, is a combination of many people-oriented behaviors, including the degree to which we engage in two-way communication with others, provide feedback, encouragement, praise, engage in friendly interaction with others, etc. Once again, some of us do those things a lot, some of us don't. Now, for many years, we looked at leaders and came to the conclusion that it's convenient if we break a leadership model into 4 different leadership styles based on those 2 dimensions, direction and support. And you will see this is the basis of the situational leadership model that I'll go over. And by the way, everybody should have one of these packets that has a copy of the situational leadership chart in it as well. So notice in this very popular leadership model, the lower right quadrant would be a person who engages in a high level of direction with below average supportive behavior. The upper right quadrant would be a person who engages in above average direction and support. Notice upper left, low direction, below average direction, combined with above average supportive behavior. And then the lower left quadrant, a leader who provides below average direction and support. Now, we tried to find the one best leadership style. That was really a common theme in management research for many years. Let's find principles of management, universal truths, one best ways to do things. But when it comes to leadership style, the conclusion was drawn, there is no one best style. The best style depends on the unique situation that you face as a leader. Well, here's where Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard come in with their situational leadership model. And let me give you an overview of this very practical approach. Over the years, I have had a chance to teach hundreds of management ideas. Without a doubt, the one that people come back to me, sometimes 30 years later, and say, that idea helped me be a better leader, is this one. I promise you, if you learn this and practice it, it will give you great benefits. Situational leadership says there is no one best leadership style. Rather, we need to change our style according to the particular situation we face. Secondly, the most important situational factor, the most important determinant of how much direction and support we should provide would be the follower's readiness level or development level with respect to what we want that follower to do. Now, the follower's readiness level depends on 4 things. It depends on that person's task-relevant training or education and task-relevant experience. Now, those words task relevant are very important. You could have a person on the team who has some advanced degree in an unrelated field who has no task relevant education. Or you might have somebody who's worked around the courts for 15 years, but if they've never done that specific task before, they might have zero task relevant experience. So the first two are asking the leader to size up the follower's ability to do the job. And the logic is very straightforward. Situational leadership suggests that we lead people who are able in a very different manner than people who are not able. Notice that we're also asked to consider a couple of willingness factors, namely the individual's achievement motivation level. Some people have a burning desire to achieve, grow, develop, be challenged. Others don't. And some people are willing and confident to accept responsibility, whereas other people tend to avoid responsibility. Those two things can be summed up with the word willingness. Now, assessing the readiness level of the follower is the first step in using situational leadership. So to help people remember what to assess, we always suggest keeping in mind this common phrase, ready, willing, and able. Readiness depends on willingness and ability. Now, there are 4 categories or levels of readiness, and let's take a look at these categories. The lowest level of readiness, which we call R1, would be a person who is very unable to do the job, very unwilling to do the job, or both. So it's very unable and or very unwilling. Now the and or implies there are 3 different kinds of R1s that we have to deal with from time to time, and this is important. Give me just a minute to elaborate. One kind of R1 we sometimes have to deal with is the very unable person who happens to be willing. Now, a good example of that is some brand new, inexperienced employee who couldn't be more willing, more enthusiastic, but they're pretty clueless on what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. So our point is, if the person is very unable, the willingness really doesn't matter at that point. It's best to consider them R1 and treat them accordingly. Another kind of R1, unfortunately, we have to deal with from time to time, the very unwilling person who happens to be able. Our suggestion is if a person is behaving in a very unwilling manner, their ability at that moment in time really doesn't matter, and we're better off to consider them R1 and treat them accordingly. And then if we ever have to deal with people who are very unable and very unwilling, we should likewise consider them at that R1 level. I've had a few people suggest we should call that person an R0, but let's not complicate things here. Let's just say they're also R1s. Notice R2, that's a person below average in ability, but he or she is willing. R3, that's a person who's grown to an above average level of ability, but he or she is not fully confident or perhaps not fully enthusiastic. And finally, R4, the highest level of readiness would be a person who is developed to the point that he or she is very able, very willing, and very confident. So the key point thus far is that it is the readiness level of the follower that determines the appropriate leadership style for you to use. Now, this is the actual situational leadership model, and notice it is based on that popular 4-quadrant leadership style model with 2 things added. A bell-shaped curve has been added to the leadership style matrix, plus another dimension has been added below representing the readiness level of the follower. Notice that the readiness scale ranges from low readiness, R1 at the right, over to high readiness, R4 at the left. The steps for using situational leadership are listed here. We start by assessing the readiness level of that follower with respect to the particular task you would like that person to perform. You then plot that readiness assessment along the readiness scale, draw a line up until it intersects with the bell-shaped curve, and then that point of intersection indicates the appropriate style to use with that person at that point in time. Now, I find the easiest way to explain how this is supposed to work is to walk through a couple of very important examples. The first is called the developmental cycle, where we have an inexperienced R1 team member, and we want to help that person grow to the R4 level as quickly and comfortably as possible by moving through 4 sequential stages or styles. That's called the developmental cycle. Also, we'll take a look at the regressive cycle, which gives us some guidelines on how to deal with the person who used to be at a high readiness level, R4, but for whatever reason or to whatever degree that person has slipped back down the scale. Okay, developmental cycle first. Imagine some new person gets added to your core team who has no experience doing what they're going to be asked to do. We'll make it the extreme example. Now, 8 a.m., day 1, that person is going to be at which readiness level? R1, 2, 3, 4. Answer? R1. So we would plot that assessment here, draw a line up until it intersects with the bell-shaped curve here, and situational leadership would say, okay, leader, that's a good starting point with that brand new person. Now, that point of intersection prescribes 2 behaviors. One thing it tells the leader to do is to provide an extremely high level of direction, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you have a person who has no idea where to begin in his or her job, and you want that individual to begin to become productive, you got to take time to tell them what to do, how to do it, etc., etc. A lot of direction is clearly called for. Now, this second prescription is not so obvious. This also says you should provide a lower amount, not a 0 amount, but a below average amount of supportive behavior. Sometimes people are puzzled by that and say, well, why don't you start out with a high level of supportive behavior? Let me elaborate. Notice that it doesn't matter where the follower is on the readiness scale. There should always be some supportive behavior. There should always be some 2-way communication, feedback, encouragement, praise. But what we're saying is, you're better off to start out at a relatively low level on the supportive behavior and then rapidly ramp it up when you observe appropriate behaviors on the part of this new employee. Plus, think this through with me. Day 1, it really wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to spend a lot of time praising some brand new person. How come? They haven't done anything yet, you know. And I know there are more leaders who make the mistake of praising too little than praising too much, but there are a few of us who praise too much. And what's the downside of too much praise too soon with a brand new person? It becomes meaningless, and 6 weeks later when they finally do something significant on their own and you give them their 100th pat on the back, it won't mean anything to them. What kind of standards does it communicate? You know, sometimes people think, hey, all I got to do to get all these pats on the back is show up. You know, we want people to earn the pat on the back, okay? Also, in a dangerous work environment, which sometimes is the case for people, giving too much praise too soon can lead to overconfidence, where people think they're capable of handling something they have no business even trying, and they end up hurting themselves and maybe other people. So wait until the person's done something that earns the praise, then give it to them. It will have value, meaning, and impact. Okay, so this is the appropriate starting point with situational leadership. It is not, however, the appropriate stopping point. Unfortunately, that's a mistake some leaders make. Some get off to a good start, what we call S1 leadership, or the telling style, but then they stay S1. Now, if a leader does that, if they start with that highly directive S1 approach and then they stay S1, what impact will that have on the development of the employee? They won't develop. It stifles their development, and it fosters an unhealthy dependency on the leader always being there to make the decisions, tell people what to do, etc. So, as the leader begins to detect that the employee is increasing in ability and willingness and eventually confidence, we should change our style accordingly. And with this new person, notice that means that as they develop, we should gradually reduce the amount of direction we're providing and let them take over more and more self-control. I mean, the more able the person becomes, the less direction they're going to need from us. Plus, in addition to reducing direction, as the person does things appropriately, we should give them that pat on the back that they have earned. We should encourage them to continue to learn new things. We should take time to explain why we do things the way we do them, so their understanding of the whole operation grows. And as their understanding grows, we can start soliciting their input more and more, moving eventually out of that S1 telling style up into the S2 selling style. Now, the reason the label selling was picked for the second step in the developmental cycle is that through the gradual reduction in direction, combined with the increased feedback, encouragement, and praise, we're trying to sell that person on his or her ability to grow and develop in that job. We're trying to get them to psychologically buy into their own career development, so that by the time they reach average readiness, we have made our standards and expectations clear. We have reduced direction to a moderate extent where we're not hanging over their shoulders, micromanaging them, nor totally neglecting them. It's moderate direction, moderate control. And we have established a highly supportive, open, friendly, trusting relationship with that person. Okay, next. When we believe that that person has grown to an above average level of ability, it's very important to make a transition to the left side of the curve, namely S3 leadership, which is called the participating style or participative management style, characterized by a below average amount of direction combined with an above average amount of of supportive behavior. Now, we found this third step in the developmental cycle is sometimes a stumbling block for people. And let me explain why. In our original research, when we looked at how people develop in their jobs, almost everybody goes through a phase where they're able, but they're not fully confident. Think of that. A person's grown to the point they're able, but they're not fully confident. Well, that's where S3 leadership works extremely well. Why? Well, because the person is able, the leader should stop telling the person what to do and how to do it, and rather make them think for themselves. However, because the individual lacks confidence, what should the leader provide? Answer: supportive behavior. More specifically, feedback, encouragement, praise, all of which are conducive to a person gaining confidence. Now, why is it a stumbling block? Here's what happens. An R3 who's able but lacks confidence comes trotting up to the leader and says, "Hey, I got problem ABC. What should I do?" Now, upon being asked that question, what would a lot of leaders do? Tell them what to do. Well, go do XYZ. And the leader sits there thinking, wow, boy, am I a great leader. My folks come in asking me questions and I dispense my wisdom. But if the objective is help the individual grow to R4, that would not be the ideal way of responding to that question from an R3. What would be a better response? What do you think? How do you think we should do this? And I'll bet we know some leaders who rarely ask that question, what do you think? And not asking that question at the right time, namely with R3s, tends to slow down their development. And notice, as the individual continues to increase in ability and willingness and confidence, we should make the final transition to S4, which we call the delegating style. So notice we are not only continuing to reduce the direction, in this last phase we're also reducing the amount of time that we are devoting to the supportive behaviors, the hand holding and the head patting. Because when a person gets to the point where they're able, willing, and confident, they tend to know when they're doing a good job and don't need as much supportive behavior as somebody who lacks confidence. Now, a caution. Just as I said at the beginning of this developmental cycle that there should always be some supportive behavior regardless of how low the readiness level is, the same thing is true at the other end of the spectrum. I don't care how super competent the person becomes, we want to be cautious to not allow that supportive behavior to drop to too low of a level or a zero level. And think about this with me. What happens to your star R4s when the leader never says thanks, never says good job, no appreciation? They are likely to regress. And the first thing that usually goes is their willingness and enthusiasm. And they start thinking, why should I kill myself? Boss doesn't appreciate it, never a kind word. Sometimes they even say things like, heck, he or she doesn't even have a clue what I do. They're totally out of touch. And you know, if you want to sustain people at R4, you have to pay the price of being enough aware of what they're doing that you can give them a well-deserved 1 minute praising once in a while and make sure that we do it. Don't neglect your stars. I had a participant in a program in Houston a couple years ago articulate the need for this little bit of supportive behavior for R4s very well. She said, I've been working for Harris County for 15 years. I've been a supervisor for 8. I'm really good at what I do. And my boss never says thanks, and it really ticks me off. I may be low maintenance, but I'm not no maintenance, you know. So remember to do that little bit of supportive behaviors if you want to keep people at R4. Now, by the way, the research on this has found that when leaders go S1, S2, S3, S4, followers tend to grow faster and more comfortably. So it sure is great for the employee if you're blessed with a leader who systematically fosters your development. But what's in it for leaders if they succeed at developing R4 team members? What's in it for you? More productive team, frees up your time to think about next month and putting out all the fires today. And in organizations where there's more of a hierarchy than you typically have in your situation, it can increase a person's promotability. I've heard a lot of managers say, we can't move so-and-so out of that position. That's the only person down there that knows what's going on. So they don't get promoted because they haven't created an R4 replacement for themselves. So benefits for the leader, the employee, the organization overall, if we put some real dedicated effort into developing people from R1 to R4. Now, unfortunately, people sometimes regress. And let me go over a couple guidelines for how to deal with regression. Let's say you have a person been R4 for years, but all of a sudden there's errors, there's misadditions on the numbers, things aren't being filed that should be, things are starting to slip. You're noticing that. Our general suggestion is if you begin to see slippage, try backing up one style at a time until you solve the problem. And the first attempt would be, hey, I noticed that this paperwork wasn't handled properly. Is there something going on I can help with? Is there something I need to be aware of? Just kind of getting in a two-way conversation with the person. A little S3 is often all you have to do to gently nudge the person back on track. Now, unfortunately, when a star performer slips a little, leaders don't always go S4, S3. What have you seen leaders do when R4s begin to slip? Sometimes they go all the way back to S1 and just hammer the employee. You want to make it really memorable? Do it publicly. Now, if you do that, if you come down like a ton of bricks on somebody whose behaviors just started to slip a little, will you probably end up with a bigger problem than you had in the first place? Probably so. So I guess the message here is don't overreact to regression. Try the back up one style at a time rule. And then if S3 doesn't work, a little S2. Hey, maybe I need to explain the problems we're going to run into down the road if we don't do these things correctly. And then at some point in time, we may have to go all the way to S1 and just say, you know what? Not good enough. And use whatever consequences you or your judge or others might control to make it clear that there will be some consequences if they do not do things properly. That's not a fun thing to do for most people, but sometimes it's the right thing to do. And if we don't have the courage to do it, they're more likely to continue to behave inappropriately. You know, one thing that made a lot of sense to me that I've heard several times, and I personally have felt it, if you give negative feedback to a person who deserves it, view it as an act of kindness. Because there are a lot of people who underperform in college classes, in the courtroom, in corporate America, because the boss doesn't have the courage to say, you know what, these are reasonable standards, I expect you to come up to them, and if you don't, there will be some consequences, and it might just be that I'm going to talk to you about it. But if they don't see a relationship between misbehavior and consequences, there are some people who won't improve. So try the back up one style at a time rule. By the way, there are a couple of exceptions to this back up one style at a time rule. If the person does something absolutely unacceptable, verging on illegal, unethical, major safety violation, sexual harassment, looking at inappropriate websites on their computer. I mean, clear no-nos. They know better. They've been told, taught, trained, not allowed to do it. They do it anyway. We would suggest going straight to S1, tell the person in no uncertain terms this won't be tolerated, and if you do it again, here are the bad things going to happen. Again, not a fun thing to do, but the most effective thing to do under those clear-cut circumstances. Why? Well, ignoring it is no deterrent to the person doing it again. S3 might actually be perceived as positive reinforcement by some people who start thinking, hey, the way to get the judges or the coordinators or the boss's attention is to do something naughty, then I get the person's time and attention. We clearly don't want to reinforce that. Even S2 doesn't work as well as S1. Why? Well, S2, while it is very directive, is also very communicative and supportive. If I patiently listen to my employees' excuses as to why they skipped those steps in our very important procedures, while I'm listening to what they're saying, what are they trying to convince themselves of? That they did the right thing. And the chance they'll do it again is a lot greater than if we say, hey, you know what, I don't really want to hear about it, you need to hear me. We got to follow these rules. And you know which rules have to be followed to the letter. And they exist in every organization. So, bottom line, strive to help people grow from R1 to R4 by moving S1, 2, 3, 4. If you observe regression, back up one style at a time unless a person does something inappropriate. Second example of where we would jump straight back to S1, the person's job has changed. And my gosh, how much change have you had in the technologies you employ? All of a sudden you got a new software program you have to use. Person doesn't even know how to open it up, let alone use it. So what should the leader do? Recognize, uh-oh, they're now R1 on this new part of their job, and provide them with the direction they need. Either personally, if you understand it, and if not, get them the direction they need from a colleague, the vendor, whoever. Keeping in touch with where are my people on my team, R1, 2, 3, 4, and then providing directly or indirectly the appropriate amount of direction and support will enhance the performance of them individually and the team collectively. Now, unfortunately, sometimes leaders don't use the appropriate style. And let's look at a couple examples. Under leadership in its most extreme situation would be when you have a leader who uses S4 with a R1 employee. Let's assume a very inexperienced R1 employee. Think back if you were ever in that situation. Maybe brand new in a job, you got no direction, no real support. Well, if you go to that individual and ask, how do you feel about your job? Those followers tend to express frustration. And if you ask, why are you frustrated? They typically say things like, well, I'm confused, lost, floundering around, spinning my wheels, going nowhere, learning nothing. Because they desperately need direction, but they're not getting any direction. And that Frustration and confusion will lead to a low level of satisfaction, a low level of performance, and slow growth in readiness, because this person is not being given the basic S1 direction that they need to get started down the readiness scale. That's a heavy price to pay, yet I'm sure all of us have seen it happen time and time again. That's not the only price that will be paid. The leader may pay a price as well, because if you go up to the follower and say, how do you feel about that leader? They often express resentment toward the leader who is neglecting them, a lack of respect for the leader. In other words, negative feelings toward that person who is under-leading that individual or group. The other mismatch I'd like to review is called over-leadership. And the extreme here would be S1 with R4s. You go up to an R4, very able, willing, confident, being directed by an S1 and ask, how do you feel about your job? They will be quick to express their frustration, right? We've all been in that situation. And if you ask, hey, why are you frustrated? They say things like, well, I'm being micromanaged, over-controlled, stifled, can't use what I know, which in turn will lead to rapidly deteriorating satisfaction, can eventually lead to deteriorating performance and regression in readiness, because of what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy idea. If a leader treats an individual as if he or she is immature, and you continue to treat them as if they're immature, how are they going to behave sooner or later? With immature behavior. They tend to regress. As a matter of fact, if that over-leadership continues long enough, it can lead to a very immature reaction from followers called malicious obedience. Now, have you ever seen employees play the game of malicious obedience? What are the rules? How do you play? You do exactly what you're told to do, nothing more, nothing less, even when what you have been told to do is wrong. And then you do it to the letter, put a spotlight on it, email everybody. And what's the aim of the game? What are those employees trying to do when they're playing malicious obedience? Do in the boss, make the boss look bad. Well, when we treat people as if they're immature, it does tend to elicit an immature response. Plus, how do people feel who are being micromanaged? Again, it causes negative reactions, resentment, anger, a lack of respect, negative feelings toward that leader. So my point is, if we want to avoid all of these problems, put some energy into taking a few seconds before you interact with that other person, who might be a part of your court team. They might be somebody who's dealing with your court who's not part of your team. But if we can assess where are they on the readiness scale, that helps us provide an appropriate amount of direction and support. Now, you all have this package, and what I'm going to ask you to do is, and you don't have to do it right now, but the green questionnaire is called the Leadership Style Questionnaire Self. And sometime in the next week or so, while it's fresh on your minds, I'd like you to look at the 12 situations. Imagine that you are the leader in each of those situations, and indicate A, B, C, or D, which is closest to the way you would respond if you were the leader in that situation. Now, there is a danger filling this out. to circle the answer that sounds like the right way of handling it without putting yourself in the story. So kind of bottom line, be honest. If one of your employees behaved like that, what would you do? A, B, C, or D? There is a green score sheet which is easy to use, okay? And what we can find from this questionnaire is your basic style. That's the style that ends up with the highest score. We can also identify any backup or supporting styles that you see yourself having. Those would be any styles with a score of 2 or more. And then by adding together your basic and supporting styles, we can get a picture of your typical range of leadership behavior. That's the score sheet where you transfer your answers, adding up the number of circled answers you end up with in each column. Those raw scores get transferred to the matrix. And finally, there's a conversion table where you can convert the raw scores into percentages. Now, the reason this is important is that very few of us are naturally comfortable in all 4 of those styles. You know, I've seen many people who have some problems doing S1. And keep in mind, there are 2 important types of S1. There's the directive S1 aimed at somebody who is unable. You know, there are a lot of folks who lack the patience to take the time with a person who doesn't know what to do and use nickel words to clearly and systematically explain what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, when they're supposed to do it. It takes patience, which some of us lack. The other kind of S1 is the corrective type of S1 that would be aimed at a person who is unwilling. And as mentioned earlier, that's sometimes out of the comfort zone of people to say, hey, just not good enough. Try to view it as an act of kindness. Do it when necessary. And by the way, one of the benefits of using the corrective S1 with people when they misbehave is that you won't have to use that behavior very much because people won't take advantage of you. You think back on the people you've seen taken advantage of, they're often the ones who don't have the guts to use that corrective S1 when it's necessary. S2, I've seen people who just don't like to take the time to explain why we do things the way we do them and help people gain an understanding of the bigger picture and all the different stakeholders and the secondary and tertiary implications of what they do. But if we want people to become fully competent and maximize their contributions to our team, somebody's got to take time to do that. S3. I've seen people have problems with that. I've seen some leaders who, if they're going to be in a meeting where a decision's going to be made, they're going to control the decision. And it's really hard for them to kind of back off and facilitate a conversation of other experienced, smart people and let them largely decide without controlling the outcome. And then, like you, I've seen people who just have trouble letting go and allowing able, willing, confident people to fly on their own power. So certainly the self-assessment questionnaire is a way to provide some information on what you see as your primary styles and styles you don't use so much, and may give you some indications on styles that are outside your comfort zone. More importantly, in the envelope, you've got the same questionnaire, but the other version. And I'm going to give you a back-on-the-job assignment, okay? This is my questionnaire. You go ahead and make copies for everybody on your team. Put your name on the front here. You might want to do this for the judge, too. That's always fun. And then they are asked, the same situation, same 4 answers, only they are asked to indicate how you, thank you, or the judge would respond in those 12 situations. There's another score sheet provided for you. Go ahead and get feedback from others and compare their assessment of your leadership style to your self-perception. I promise you that that will be a productive thing to do. And having a conversation on situational leadership, you know, and mentioning to people, if you ever feel that you are being micromanaged, come on in and let's talk about it. And if you ever feel I'm providing inadequate direction and support, come on in. I'm receptive to that kind of conversation, and my goal is to help everybody perform to the best of their ability. One other comment. In my 2 sessions later in the day, I'm going to pick up from this and talk about this more as a team building activity, focusing not so much one-on-one with people, but developing high performance teams. I did bring copies of a book that you can get during the lunch hour with some green ticket that's in your badge. And I did sign all of them. I'm suffering from writer's cramp today, but I did sign all of them to you. And it gives you a lot of good suggestions on how to assess your team's effectiveness and identify opportunities for improvement and develop action plans to increase your effectiveness as a team. At any rate, I am a true believer in situational leadership, and I know that if you practice it, it will serve you well. I'm honored to be here with you today. I hope you have a very successful conference and week, an enjoyable time here in this beautiful city. Thank you for asking me. Appreciate it. Thank you.